Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today. I'm Rob Waring. I'm going to be talking about how to write graded reading stories. So the main aim for me today is to try to make sure you understand what it means by a story. Now, stories could be fiction or nonfiction. It's quite possible to have a nonfiction story, the story of the life of Paris, for example, or the story of a person's life, right? So that would be a story in a sense. But today I'm going to be talking about fiction, particularly fiction. I'm going to be talking about. So when you're writing a story, there's three important things to consider. The first one is you have to have a good story. The second one is you have to have a good story. And the third one is, you can guess, you have to have a good story, right? So if you don't have a good story, then people are going to put the book down. As Dorothy was saying, if the materials that your students are reading they're not interested in, then they're going to try and find something else. And if you don't have good stories, it's going to be a big problem. So where do stories come from? Now, the slides you've got here, I'm going to be largely reading from them. The reason for that is I'm going to go very fast today. There's a lot to cover. So please download the slides and go back at your pace reading through some of these slides. And I've tried to have most of my major points are actually on the slide. I'm not the kind of guy who has lots of fancy pictures and very little text. I want you to actually learn something from this. So most of the things I'm going to be saying are actually written on the slides purposefully. So please feel free to download the slides at the end. I'll give you the QR code. Right, so where do stories come from? Well, they're more than just a list of events. And we often see many stories are a list of events leading to an ending. There's a reason that the story exists. It has to exist for a reason. It's about something. There's a message, there's a meaning, and the way that we express this is through the premise, which is the center of the story and the reason the story exists. So let's look at the premise, the key idea. So when you're thinking about a story, what would you write about? Well, you could write about love or promiscuity or jealousy or fear, or you could, oh, love twice appears there, pity, addiction, vigilance, foolishness. All of these are ideas about which you could write stories. But these are not a premise. These are key words. These are ideas, right? So let's look at some premises here. So generosity leads to poverty, for example. So you can be too generous and you end up being poor. Ill temper leads to isolation. So there's something that you can't control your temper, therefore you lose friends. Dishonesty leads to exposure. Egotism leads to a lot of friends, and so on. You can see here, the key point about all of these premises that you see is there's a change. There's a change. There's something that happens as a result of something. Something happened. You become poor because you were maybe too generous. You become isolated because of your character. So we need to have a premise written in a good way. So what makes a fantastic story? Well, we need a strong premise, not just any premise. We need a strong concept. So, for example, if a guy comes home for his father's funeral only to hear he was murdered, so he has to discover the truth and ensure justice is done. So this is a strong premise. You know, there's a reason the story to exist, and we know what the ending would be, which is the truth and justice. So this is a strong premise. You can tell a lot about the story just from those two sentences, right? So having a clear, very clear premise like this, basically you can write the story because you know what to write. You'd have to set up who the guy was, who the father was, and we'd have to find out how the murderer committed the crime and so on. But the premise is very clear. It raises questions. This is dramatic. We want to know who the murderer is, what will our hero do about it, and how will he get the justice that he wants. So every story, fiction, should have some kind of message or meaning to it. There has to be a reason for writing it. And the questions are answered by the end of the story. So in this particular one, we have a premise, investigation solves crimes. Now that's not really a very nice premise. It's kind of a weak premise, right? So we need something a little bit stronger than that. We need something that really shows drama. So something like relentless doggedness brings about justice. The person is never giving up. He finds all kinds of barriers to get the truth. Maybe he's had some problems with the friends of the murderer, or the murderer is trying to kill him as well. But he never gives up trying to find justice for his father. So that's a far stronger premise than just investigating solves a crime. So if we look back at our premises I showed you before, we could then have not just generosity leads to poverty, it would be foolish generosity leads to dire poverty. Violent ill temper leads to complete isolation, right? So here we have more extremes. We have a stronger story. It's more dramatic because we're adding in that extra dimension to the premises, yeah? So it's not just dishonesty, it's continued dishonesty leads to exposure, not just to friends, but to public exposure, and maybe lead to some kind of a downfall. Here you could easily imagine something like a business person or a movie star who would fall down in the public's eyes. Yeah. Unchecked egotism leads to complete loss of friends. Unrestrained fickleness leads to loss of all self-esteem, and so on and so on. So try to think about some extremes. So why do we need a premise? Well, we need a roadmap, a direction, and we call this, maybe some people say it's a goal or a root idea or a theme or central conflict. But the point is about the premise, it leads to it, unmistakably leads to the goal. It leads to a resolution. It shows what forces are at play. So you know, for example, in the story about the murder, we know that there's going to be a murderer. We know there's going to be some problem the guy's got to face in order to solve that murder. If the premise is poor, it leads to a muddled story. It leads to a story that's not clear. It just goes in various directions. And the reader halfway through the story is like, well, what's happening with this story? I don't follow what's going on. So is the motivating power in it is the motivating power in everything we write, yeah? So it's the writer's job to ensure the answer to the premise is not simple. You don't just make it easy from the outcome to know what's going to happen, right? So if you have, for example, people going out on a rickety old boat that's leaking, we know immediately by the end of the story, the boat's going to sink and somebody's going to drown. So don't make it too easy for us to guess, yeah? So if we look at a story, for example, like Romeo and Juliet, and please don't read this. Thank you, ChatGPT, for it created this for us. But what's this about? All of us know Romeo and Juliet. Basically, the premises here is great love defies death. Or you could see it slightly differently. Feuds lead to destruction. And I'm sure all of you here have some familiarity with Romeo and Juliet coming from opposite families who hated each other. Anyway, they ended up killing each other. And so this is the story here. And if we have a different story, let's say about a frugal man, a man who doesn't like to spend money. So a man is frugal. He doesn't like spending money. So what's the point of this story? Well, is being frugal good or bad? Well, both, right? Good because you're saving money, but bad because, well, maybe there's some problems from that. So if we have premise A, saving money for a rainy day leads to a secure, safe life, well, that's, there's a change there. You know what's going to happen, but it's a boring story. There's not much drama going to happen here. Very little is going to go. It's quite predictable, right? But in premise B, frugality leads to destruction. So being too careful with your money destroys you or destroys your family, destroys something about your life. So how would this happen? Well, it could be because a guy cheats on his taxes and then he has to pay triple the amount of money or goes to jail. Or he doesn't pay child support for his divorced wife and therefore he goes to jail. Or he doesn't repair his car and the car he has to walk to work, for example, right? So here you can see that there's a movement that we have, and it's much more dramatic than saving money for a rainy day, yeah? So we can imagine a conflict and counter-conflict in each case here. So let's imagine we're often told that if you're writing a story, you can maybe use people that you know. So let's assume that you have an Aunt Jane. And who is this Aunt Jane of yours? Well, your Aunt Jane is a busybody. She always likes to get into other people's business. She's a gossip. She butts into the life of others. She interferes in other people's life. And she's a deeply religious person, right? So this is your Aunt Jane. So what kind of a story can we have about Aunt Jane? Well, we know what she's like, but the question is, why? Why does she act this way? What's her core? What's driving her to be a busybody, a gossip? Why is she butting into the lives of others? So our backstory is we learn that she was promiscuous in her youth. She had many boyfriends in her youth, and she was not a very moral person. Now she's moral, but before she was not. We also learn she had a secret love affair that broke a marriage and led to the suicide of her lover, right? So here, the lover, the man would, for example, kill himself because of a secret love affair, right? So because of this event, our Aunt Jane turned to God for forgiveness, right? So now Aunt Jane's mission in life is to warn against sinfulness. Now we know why she's a busybody. Now we know why she butts into the life of others, right? And now we know why she has religious convictions, right? So the question is, how are we going to end Aunt Jane's story? What's the point of the story? All we've done so far is set up this situation. And maybe by chapter 3 or 4, we're now at the point is, okay, what are we going to do with our Aunt Jane? What are we going to say about a person like Aunt Jane? Well, we can't just have Jane die in her sleep. That's just very unsatisfying. We can't just have her die. So what we need to do is to have possibly some kind of a downfall as a result of her actions, right? So this comes back to how you decide and your premise. What's your conviction here? How you decide the story is going to play out. So it has to be an extreme action leads to destruction. We've already seen that it's going to be her downfall as a result of her actions and so on. So it could be revenge from the wife. Maybe the wife comes along and kills Jane, for example. And that gives you the idea of you pay a price for your actions. Or the religious zeal leads to being kicked out of her church is one other possibility, right? She's too religious and she's giving the church a bad name. Or her own suicide would be the result, maybe through regret or exposure. So here what you see is we have a character, we built up a character, but a character comes from something that happened in her life, particularly came about for her decisions. So her character and the drama was made because of her decision to have the secret love affair. So we need therefore to have a story which has high stakes. So the story of a family running away from a dictator has strong potential for a story because the stakes are high. They are literally life and death. And sadly, this is playing out globally right now in several countries. But a story about a girl who lost her teddy bear isn't going to hold interest with adults very long. Right? We're not going to be motivated by this. So high stakes stories make a reader sympathize with the characters, right? So we need to sympathize with the characters. We need to feel their pain. So the stakes ought to be of vital importance to the character. Now, that does not mean that they have to be vitally important to you, but they have to be very important to the character. So in the second sentence here, I mentioned about a story about a girl who lost her teddy bear. Now, for adults, that's not going to work, but this could be vitally important to a child, for example. The teddy bear could be her life. It could be her only friend in the world. So there's a dramatic story for children there, but it would not hold the interest of adults. So if we have a story about love, we go back to our Romeo and Juliet, for example, you could have a story that's based on Romeo and Juliet's premise. And you might think, okay, well, that's copyright, isn't it? Well, West Side Story is basically Romeo and Juliet. So is Titanic, so is Shakespeare in Love, and so is Valley Girl. So it's perfectly okay to borrow the premise, just don't use Romeo and Juliet and set it in the 14th century. So let's look at this. Let's look at the story of Romeo and Juliet. So what kind of love do they have? It is great love. Not just any love, great love that defies death. So their love should live beyond their death. So now, if this is your premise, if this is your direction you're going, you need to set up your story to show they have great love. And you need to set up the story to show that death is the result. And you need to prove your premise the way you construct your story. So, for example, you premise me that something like life is worthless without the loved one, or great love overcomes prejudice, hatred, and adversity. And both of these happen in the story of Romeo and Juliet. So the reader should be moved by the actions of the characters. Yes, you might not agree with what Romeo and Juliet have done, but you should be moved by the depth of their feelings. So we have to have characters here that are strong enough to carry the premise. We have to have a strong Romeo and a strong Juliet. We can't have Romeo being an indecisive, weak, superficial, unemotional, fickle character. It's just not going to work. Similarly, we can't have Juliet being a silly, unemotional, scheming type of lady. She's got to be razor focused on the love with Romeo. Yeah. So the question is, if you have this as your premise, what obstacles are you going to put in their way? It's only becoming an interesting story if we somehow frustrate them, either by their own actions or the circumstances around them. And in this story, as you know, the circumstances of the two families prevent them from being together. So what battles must they fight? How do they battle to get together? How do they fight their own families? How do they find time together? How will you show their determination? Notice it's great love. So they have to be really, really determined to be together. How do they grow together in stature and conviction? Yes. How do we have that development? And how are you going to end the story showing great love? Right. So what I'm trying to say here in this section is that an idea is not enough. Just simply a story that says a girl murders her mother, a man embezzles money, a quiet boy begins to bully, a lion befriends a zebra, isn't really good enough for a story. You need a driving motivation. You need a backstory that would really push the story along, and it would come from their decisions. So a girl murders her mother. Why? What's the backstory to that? The man embezzles money. Why? And so on. So if we have a story, jealousy leads to death, fine. So what did the jealousy spring from? Was the woman flirtatious? Was the man of a different class? You could imagine a story set 100 years ago where class was really important. Was she bored with her husband? Did the man have mistresses? So if the premise is promiscuity during marriage leads to jealousy and murder, we must know the one thing that caused the jealousy, right? And we have to remember also that promiscuous people act differently from those who are not. Yeah? So how are you going to bring that in? Yeah. So what's the backstory that she has to have to lead to kill, not just divorce or stay? So this is clearly a story about the woman, the woman's motivation. This is not a story about the man. This is a story about the woman. Or you may have something like juvenile delinquency is a bad thing. You know, kids acting up in the street, causing trouble is a bad thing. We can all agree with that. So for example, you'll have some kids in a gang committing crimes and terrorizing the neighborhood. Fine, but why? Are they doing it for money? Are they doing it for fun? Are they bored? Is there some ambition? For example, maybe one of the gang members sees a life of crime as the dream job. Or are they just trying to protect their area from another gang? So you may have different members of the gang have different motivations to be in the gang, and that leads to a tension. One of them may be there for money, one of them there be to relieve boredom, another one feels trapped maybe and can't escape the gang. So there's all kinds of potential issues going on there. So what's your premise? What's your conviction? If this is your premise, what are you going to say about that? Well, are you going to indict society? Are you going to criticize, for example, parents and education? Is this the reason we have juvenile delinquency? Or it could be misplaced concept of manhood leads to destruction. You may find that somebody thinks, I have to be a man, I have to be strong, I have to be violent, as a misplaced concept of manhood. How will that play out in the end? Or are you going to be commenting on crime is the only way out of poverty? Maybe you could have a story that poverty encourages crime. Now, of course, at the end, you have to be punished, but poverty is the driver. You're going to have a story about poverty driving crime. So, but there's not really enough here for a premise. We need the key motivator, and the key motivator is a good character or good set of characters. Characters are revealed through their conflict. So the important thing to remember is that a character has to make a choice. We decide, for example, you're going to do A or B, and that tells us about this. So if you suddenly find, you're at the bank and the cashier walks away, and there's $10,000 sitting on the bank and the bank counter, and there's 1 second to the door. Are you going to take that money? Are you not going to take that money, right? So your choice will tell us about your character, right? So the characters make a decision based on your premise. The character's decision sets in motion another decision, for example, from an antagonist, yeah? And these decisions propel the story forward. So if we have, for example, a story about this man here, we can see that what this man is doing here, his choice is, in this disaster, he's rescuing this cat, right? So this tells us something about it. There's been a fire, and this man is rescuing the cat. It tells us about his choice, tells us about his character. Now, this next picture was a very famous picture some years ago. It's this one. Maybe you've all seen this one. And this picture was often thought to be that this girl caused the fire. And she doesn't care about the cat. She wants to see the cat die. Now, I don't know if that's actually true with this picture, but you can see a difference there in their choices. On the left, the man goes in to rescue the cat. On the right, the girl smiles because she can hear the cat in pain. Tells us about their character. So apologies to the lady if it's not actually what happened. So great characters and settings should drive your story. They should be original and not too stereotypical. They should be believable, alive, and interesting, and have depth and not just simply be wooden. They have to be faithful to their personality. They emerge from their choices, as I've said. Yeah, they have a reason for being there. So the characters have to follow their story arc logically as an outcome of their backstory, as we saw with Aunt Jane. So there's three main aspects to character development. The first one is physiological. Then we have sociological and psychological. We need to have these, at least you need to know about your characters. Even if this doesn't appear in the story, you need to have some idea of who your character is and why they're doing these things. So for example, for appearance, these could be reflected in their sex or gender, heredity, size, color of eyes, and so on, yeah? So how has their physical appearance affected them? Maybe they're being bullied because they have a big nose or big ears. How did that affect them? Maybe they felt discrimination due to their skin color. Or maybe because they're small, they were considered unintelligent and weak. So how has your character been developed because of their appearance? Maybe this is a factor. Or maybe their social background, their class, occupation, education, home life, hobbies, religion, da-da-da-da-da. All of these probably have some impact on how the character was developed. What's their background, family, upbringing? What do you know about your characters? So in the Romeo and Juliet story, we know about their characters. We know about their background. We know how their parents influenced them, and so on and so on. Yeah. So how do these things make up their background? So in the fourth one here, maybe they were influenced sociologically by religion or a drunken father or a smothering mother, for example. Yeah. And it may be something to do with the setting. The last one is psychological. The psychological dimension emerges from both the social and the physical. This involves their moral standards, their ambition, their personal premises, frustrations, disappointments, their temperament. What has happened to them in their life that makes them the person that they are? What drives them? What's their goals? What are they afraid of? What motivates them, and how did they become this way? So when you're constructing your characters, you need to be thinking about all of these things. But what's important here is you have change. We have to have change of character in some way. So your character must change too. So we should know them in their past, and we know how they're going to be in the future. So all good stories involve some form of change or growth. And you need to plant these seeds early in the story to see how change will happen. So examples of character change. You might have someone who's submissive, happy-go-lucky, naive, trusting, or passive, for example, but they become cynical, independent. They grow up, they become bitter and disillusioned. So here we have a change in character, beginning of the story to the end of the story. And what's the story, what's the setting that's going to develop this? Or you may have a bigoted, domineering, self-confident, practical, precise, ruthless person who becomes unsure, bewildered, dependent, submissive, and so on and so on, yeah? So here we see character change. And it's important that we don't just have a sudden change, right? So we need to have transitions. There's always going to be change. We know that there's always transitions in life, from birth to childhood. You develop through adolescence, youth, and eventually death. We're familiar with transitions. But these smaller conflicts and transitions lead the character from one state of mind to another until you're compelled to decide something. Yeah? So this is about cause and effect. We need to see rising conflict when the antagonists are evenly matched, like a boxing match, right? We have to have the two main characters fighting each other and rising conflict. Yeah. So the intensity of the conflict is determined by the strength of the characters. So we need to lay the two forces on the circumstances behind the sequence. It leads to our explosive climax. As I say, we can't have one strong, one weak character. We have to have them both strong. We also have to make sure that the emotional journey is not sudden. So if you have a character who's got possessive love, very involved in disappointment, doubt, and questioning, the person goes from love to hatred, but they don't jump from love to hatred. They've got to go through various stages before they move to hatred. We can't just have them go love, hate. No, your story has to see them emotionally develop through the story. Similarly, if you're going from hatred to love, you've got to make sure that, for example, the hated person causes an injury, they're satisfied with their injury, then they feel remorse, they feel humility, and eventually they lead to love. So we have to see all of these stages develop when we're going from hatred to love. You don't just jump from one to the other. So these transitions come about from, as I said before, decisions. So in stories, transitions are changes in thinking and perspective. So the friendship to murder story, our story needs to reveal all the steps, not just jumping from one to the other. And we need to have a change in perspective, and that comes from a decision. So the friendship would be a perspective. Disappointment is a change in perspective triggered by an event. Annoyance is a change in perspective. So is irritation. We're having rising up to anger, will lead to assault, to a threat, to premeditation, and murder. So we've gone from friendship to murder. We need to have, as you can see in red, decisions that lead to the actions. So we have to have a variety of characters, and every movement is predicated on steps before. So strong, uncompromising characters that lead to conflict. And David, I might be, when do I finish? What's my time? I'm at 3 o'clock, is that right?
At 2:50.
2:50, okay, I have a few more minutes. Okay, great. So we can't have characters call a truce in the middle of the story. We can't just have them opt out of the story. So for example, we can't just have somebody running away from a murderer and then they can just go to the police station. No, that's not very good, right? We have to put them in a position where they cannot escape. They cannot escape. They have to turn and face their attacker. They have to make that decision. We can't just have them opt out at any time. Yeah. So don't put your characters in a position where they can compromise. So their conflict, as I say, should be inescapable to them. So this is the orchestration, as I mentioned before. Please take your time to look through the slides later and have a look through that. So in terms of character development, a sample character, here's an example. We have a tall Asian Jamaican person living in a poor part of London who smokes, drinks, drives fast cars, and chases women, right? This is a sample character. It doesn't really tell you much about the character. Now, if we add a few dimensions, for example, we can change this. But this character is probably quite stereotypical. Is it original? Not really. Is the character well-formed? Not really. Believable? Yeah, maybe, but we don't know anything that motivates or drives this character. So we need a backstory. And the backstory could be that we have the tall, arrogant Jamaican man who's outwardly pious Muslim, meaning he's Muslim on the outside, but really has this secret life of smoking, drinking, and chasing women, right? That tells us a bit about him. But we need a motivator. So his motivator is maybe his family. So he's in a community of religious conservatism and he's fighting against that. This is his way of fighting back, right? So his decision would be, do I put family before self or do I put self before family? And from that, we lead to our premise, right? So you need to have your backstory, You need to have your motivator, your decision, and therefore you have your premise. And then you have to decide, what are you going to do about this guy? So the conflict in the story really should be real conflict, at least within the context of your story. It should be real in the world that you create. So real in Harry Potter is different from the real world, but within that world, it should be real. The characters come from situations and events. There can be mental conflict. Should be inescapable, as I mentioned. It must be progressive, ever building, and it could be internal. So you don't necessarily need an antagonist. The antagonist could be yourself. So it's your duty as an author to make your characters suffer. So there's 4 aspects of conflict. Let's just go through them very quickly. So we have a story here about Adam, who meets Sue, is a nice girl. He invites her to a show, but she's uncertain of him. So he needs some new clothes to impress her. He wants to buy a suit, but he has no money. Too many bills, he has to pay college. Adam feels old, he can't provide for Sue, so he drops her. So Adam's upset and listless at work. He keeps thinking of Sue. Job hub comes up with nothing. He feels useless and depressed. So this is our character. This is our background. What are we going to do about him? Well, what's his stamina? How much suffering can he endure? What's his hope? Does he have imagination? Does he have a long-term plan? Is he physically able to do something about this? What forces are opposing him? So what can we say about Adam? Well, the first thing we need to do is to avoid stasis. If there's no change in Adam, then there's no story. If Adam started with hope and ended with uncertainty, and she started with uncertainty and ended with uncertainty, then we're not really going to get very far, right? So we need to make sure that, you know, we make sure that the person, we can't just have Adam go off into the distance, right? So he has to do something. So Adam has to make a decision. If he's a coward, no one driving him, no conviction, there's nothing to empathize with. So we can see this in something like this. This is a weak character. Do you love me? I don't know. Can't you make up your mind? I will. When? Soon. How soon? I don't know. So in this kind of a dialogue, nothing is happening here. There's no change in status. The next thing to avoid is jumping conflict. So Adam robs a bank to get money for Sue and to entertain Sue. So if we have our character Adam again, which I said before, this is Adam. Yeah. So Adam is like this, and then suddenly Adam comes and robs a bank. It's like, what? Where did that come from? Right? So we can't have him suddenly do something, right? So these are some examples of conflict where you could jump too quickly. You have to build up the steps between. So in this dialogue, do you love me? Oh, I don't know. Don't be stupid. Make up your mind, will you? Smart guy, huh? Not so smart if I fall for someone like you. Shut up or I'll smack you. So we've got at the beginning, do you love me? We've got violence in 6 sentences. So this is way too fast for the drama here. Way too fast for the drama. You need to build it up. And make sure you don't have unrealistic events. These are called Deus Ex Machina. These are called God out of the machine. So examples of a hero is trapped, but a bomb hits the door and opens it without hurting him, right? So you see this in, for example, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Two rescuers suddenly arrive without being called. We see this in Lord of the Flies, Harry Potter 2, and Lord of the Rings. Luckily, the hero arrived just as the main action is happening. Guess what? Wizard of Oz. Surprise disease luckily kills the attacking Martians, War of the Worlds. And there are other examples here where something external is solving the story, and this is deeply unsatisfying. Please don't do that. Make sure your characters resolve the story themselves. Yeah. The third one is we have to have rising conflict. Adam builds his career so he can provide. Sue can't wait, and she moves, so he might move into illegality to try to keep her. So this is how Adam builds his character, right? We see the tension rising. It's a natural sequence of progression to his eventual decision. I'm sorry, I have to go quickly here. Rising conflict emerges from a clear premise. What is the driving factors for Adam? And the transitions here are presented to show changes in perspective. We need to have the transitions that go from one aspect of the story to the next, yeah? And the last one is foreshadowing. We need to be given some seeds early in the story to learn more about Adam's backstory. So we need to know a little bit about his past that will be revealed later. Yeah. So we set the seeds up to force the sides against each other, the premise of the story. Yeah. So conflict is the heartbeat of the writing, but should only come from foreshadowing, logical chain of events, and from the decisions of the characters. Yeah. The chain events might not be logical to you, but they should be very convincing and logical to the character themselves, right? So those are the things that we need to have a look at. So we can see here, we go back to where we were from love to hatred. We need to see what are the decisions in your story. If you're going to go from love to hatred, what are the decisions? Where are the decisions in this? Where's the rising? Where's the conflict that our character is going to have to face? So we have to make sure we have a satisfying and believable payoff. This is the last slide. All the crises lead to something that resolves our premise, and we have a clear psychological and physical resolution. The psychological resolution is often much, much harder. And finally, here is the QR code. Please get the QR code. In fact, somebody has already dropped, and it was me, dropped the Dropbox link into the window. I'm sorry, we don't have time for questions. Sorry for being a minute late, David.
Rob, I will add your download link to the follow-up email, so everybody will get that also.
That's lovely. Thank you, David.
And I think, we can have, 3 or 4 minutes for questions if you want to put.
Okay, sure. So I do apologize for going very, very quickly over this. And there's a lot to say about the story. Now, if anybody's actually interested in writing their own story and you feel you have a story in you, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help you develop a story, and maybe one day we could even put it on X Reading to make some money. You never know, right? So if you do have a story in you, a few stories in it, or you could approach Dorothy. She has a publishing house. Maybe she'll publish your story one day. You never know.
Rob, if I might ask a question, please.
Yes. For some reason, yes, go ahead. Yes.
Okay. The writing for a graded reader, there seemed to me that your description of story and how to write a story, great, thank you for that. But there seem to be some constraints, or seems to me to be some constraints for writing for graded readers.
Absolutely.
First of all, you want to limit the vocabulary to a particular level.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you do that. That might be fairly simple, but the other thing is that, are there certain themes or certain topics or whatever that might be more suitable for certain grades?
Okay, well, you do have to be quite careful of some topics. If you want to have your book, if you publish a book, you want it to be sold into schools. Sometimes schools have, restrictions on what you can't do. So drugs, sex, glorifying violence, these are obviously no-nos for the mass market. Now, they may be fine in the market, normal marketplace, but there are some things you have to avoid. So there's quite a long list of compliance for some publishers, and that your editor can help you with, yeah? And so if you're asking about a vocabulary, I've just put a link in here. So this is ercentral.com. There's a tool I created called OGTE. So what you can do is when you're writing your story, let's say, for example, you want your story at level, I don't know, let's say level 8, for example, right? You dump your text into the tool, press go, and it will tell you how much of the story is outside level 8 or outside level 3 or outside level 6, right? So this is a tool that will help you. There are other tools out there that do the same thing, but they're usually quite passive. This is one you can actually actively change things. Press go again, and you can replace some of the words. So OGT is a free tool for you to be able to play around with the vocabulary. But I would suggest that you look at word lists quite carefully. Having a sense of vocabulary and sense of how to say things in easy language is not easy. Just to fill that in, some years ago, I was working on a series called Page Turners, which is produced by Cengage, which was open to authors to submit stories. We had 330 stories were submitted to us, and we only published 30. And that is because we found it very difficult. Some people are very good at understanding story, but they can't write graded text. Other people are very good with text, but are not good at story. And there's an amount of time that we can invest in someone to make sure both sides of that work really well. And writing graded readers is quite a tough task. But if you want to explore that a bit further, please contact me and we can go through that in detail. But there are definitely some restrictions.
Yeah, thank you. So the short answer to the first part of my question is can look at the publisher's website or look at the publisher's instructions on what topics and themes.
Yes, I wouldn't worry too much about topics and themes. I would really worry for yourself what you want to write about. What's important to you? What's a story, something, maybe some impact on you? You say, I want to write that story. Now, you have to also say that very few of the major publishers are accepting stories anymore. They already have several hundreds of them, and they will take only the very best, and then you'll be lucky to get it published. Very few publishers are actually publishing new stuff now, unless it's commissioned series where they say to someone, we're doing a series on X, please write 25 books about, and it's usually nonfiction material. So
I have to stop you now because Joe needs to get ready. Okay.
Yes,
So it goes on in 5 minutes.
Right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'll put my email in the chat box if anybody wants to contact me. And if you're interested in writing a story, please contact me and we'll see what we can do about developing it for you.